The problem is it's a lot of customers. Welcome to the CommStock channel. I'm Senior Analyst Brian Grete, and it seems like, based on comments from President Donald Trump, that the three sticking points for the United States, at least in the trade negotiations with China, are rare earth metals, soybeans, and fentanyl. And so two of those I want to take a look at today, and that being rare earth metals that China controls the bulk of the world's supply of, and then soybeans in terms of what China needs and what the U.S. produces and what China can get from other sources. And so I think that those two fronts are critical. The fentanyl issue is completely separate, in my opinion, from these others. Both rare earths and soybeans are commodities that can be supplied, and where you get your supply from and those types of things. And so let's start off by looking at global soybean production. Brazil is by far and away the biggest global soybean producer, having overtaken the U.S. in terms of that production years ago, and now it accounts for expected to be nearly 180 million metric tons of production in the 25-26 growing season, which is just getting underway in Brazil. Planting efforts there are just starting. So there's a little difference in production cycles, 6 months actually, being mirror image of each other between South America and North America, so Brazil and the United States. And so the United States just finished up its 2025 growing season, obviously, and it's just getting underway down in Brazil. But you can see here that Brazil outpaces the U.S. by a fair amount. The one I want to focus on is China there, and it produces, about 20 million tons of soybeans per year, consumes a little over 100 million metric tons, so basically produces about 1/5 or 20% of what it needs from a soybean perspective. Now, the bulk of that other, we'll call it 80 million metric tons that China needs to import each year, 75% of that comes from Brazil, and about 20% from the United States and 5% roughly from other countries. So if China shuts off the United States demand and doesn't purchase U.S. soybeans, is there a replacement? Well, in theory, there probably is to some degree. China would still need some U.S. soybeans over the long haul, assuming that Brazil doesn't ramp up its production by 20-25% or so as we move forward in the coming years. Now, Brazil's soybean production and expansion continues, and so that number is going to get bigger. It's just a matter of whether it could fully offset the United States. The short answer to that is probably not in the long term. In the short term, yes. Long term, probably not. It would take some doing to get there. And so China would have to turn to some other countries. Argentina would be the primary one there, and to supplant the United States, any supplies it would get from the United States. Let's look at the rare earth situation. It is much different. China produces about 3/4, depending on estimates. Some are a little bit higher than that, some are a little bit lower than that, but about 3/4 of rare earth supplies. And then it processes and turns into magnets an even greater percentage. And so those are upwards of 80% and 90% respectively. And so just having the minerals in the ground, China accounts for about 75% of those global supplies. The actual processing of that and turning it into magnets then becomes even greater. And so the United States, President Trump just signed a deal with Australia. And so you can see Australia is the world's number 4 producer of rare earths, and the United States falls at a couple slots down from that. But even if you take what the United States has and what Australia produces and combine them together, it still isn't enough to offset all the demand that the United States has. And estimates on how much rare earths the United States controls versus what it uses, I've seen estimates as low as 1%. So really small, just a small fraction of numbers that the U.S. has access to currently. You add Australia into the equation and it's still a small percentage. The issue is, and the difference between where China's situation is with soybeans and where the United States situation is with rare earth metals, is that China controls the bulk of the rare earth metals around the world. As a matter of fact, they have more than the next 10 countries combined, or roughly about the same amount as the next 10 countries combined. And so you come into a situation where the reliance on the United States for China and rare earth metals is greater than what China's reliance on the U.S. is for soybean supplies. And so as we go into these trade talks over the next week or two between high-level Chinese and U.S. officials, and then eventually between President Trump and President Xi from China at the end of the month, China seems to be holding more of the leverage, more of the trump cards, so to speak, in these negotiations. And that is critical. If China really does think that they do need U.S. soybeans less than what the U.S. needs its rare earths, the negotiations probably aren't going to go real well for the United States without some pretty significant concessions. And so that's kind of where the U.S. stands from a layman's terms of negotiations. And I don't, pretend to know all the backstory and the back negotiations and everything else that's going on. Very few people do, to be honest with you, outside of U.S. and Chinese trade officials. But on the surface, it sure does appear that the U.S. will be more reliant on Chinese rare earth metals as we move forward, even with the deal with Australia, than what China will be reliant on U.S. soybeans moving forward. And so while there is some reliance on both sides of things, it appears that China has more leverage. We will see where these all go, but each day that ticks away is another day that we are closing the window on the traditional U.S. soybean shipping season. The closer we get to Brazil's new crop harvest, it tightens up that window for which the U.S. can export soybeans to China in an economical fashion. Now, if there is some sort of comprehensive trade deal that's reached and China has to agree to purchase X number of soybeans from X date to X date, then that throws that kind of all out the window. But if we're just looking at the traditional U.S. soybean shipping season from September until about January, February timeframe when the Brazilian new crop supplies hit the global market, that window is tightening. And so we need to get some of that soybean demand on the books as quickly as possible. The other side of that is that the U.S. has customers outside of China for soybeans. The problem is it's a lot of customers versus one from China. And so to offset that demand that's lost to the Chinese market, it takes many countries. And I've mentioned this before, but the market price response is also stronger to Chinese demand for soybeans than it is to all those other countries for soybeans. So it isn't one for one. The market won't react penny for penny to non-Chinese demand as it would for the Chinese demand for U.S. soybeans. So as we sit here right now, it appears that China has more leverage than the United States as they head into these high-level negotiations over the course of the next couple of weeks. And we await, the markets await, and are paying very close attention to every last headline that comes out on this subject and reacting accordingly. But the bottom line is, to get a big move up in the soybean market, you're probably going to need some sort of comprehensive trade deal in which China agrees to buy U.S. soybeans. For the CommStock channel, I'm analyst Brian Grete.
Futures trading involves risk. The risk of loss in trading futures and/or options is substantial, and each investor and/or trader must consider whether this is a suitable investment. Past performance is not indicative of future results.